Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, because I know everyone's joining from different parts of the world. So, the benefits of Zoom sometimes. So, welcome to another edition of our dialogues with Asian Pathfinders. I am Pallavi Ade, the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, along with Shreya Deshmukh. So, today we have the culmination of our month-long series on non-traditional security threats, where we've looked at diaspora, migrants, water, food security, and now we're coming together for this discussion where we have speakers from all across the globe. Going to speak on 4 different topics. I'm not going to talk about it a lot because I know our moderator Ratna will. So I'll leave it to her capable hands for the session. So before I do, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders. We started in 2020. We are a knowledge sharing platform where we aim to bring scholars, academics, practitioners like we have today for these constructive dialogues and discussions. We do that through our fireside chats and dialogues which is today. And we always an informal forum, so we welcome feedback from the community on how we can do better. So, and that is always useful because that's how we've come so far from the support of the community. And about our upcoming session, so we're taking a break for the month of September for some internal administrative works and everything. We'll definitely be back in October with an amazing lineup of speakers and sessions. So you can always keep an eye out on our social media pages and everything to stay updated. And you can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, everywhere. So that's not a problem. One request is please stay on mute because we do record these sessions and put it on YouTube a few later, so for the benefit of the wider community. And obviously respect the views of others, but please ask your questions and put in your comments in the chat section. Once all the speakers have had their opening remarks, we will take in your questions later. Ratna will take care of it. And like I said, you can find us on social media, contact us via email. And so moving on to today's session. So I know Ratna will briefly introduce the panelists, but I have the honor because I have the honor of basically introducing one of my mentors. So Ratna Vishwanathan is the Chief Executive Officer at 𝐸𝑑𝑢𝑐𝑎𝑡𝑐, and she's based in New Delhi, India. Ratna is a highly accomplished senior development and public sector professional. She's also a former civil servant with the Government of India. And before joining 𝐸𝑑𝑢𝑐𝑎𝑡𝑐, she was a CEO at Microfinance Institutions Network, India. So over to you, Ratna.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pallavi. And yeah, looking forward to this evening. And basically what I gather from, the nature of the topic, there have been a host of previous discussions on this issue. And it says we're capping it up. So I guess we will have deeper insights than we've had earlier. So the way I would like to do this is just do a very short context setting because I think people are here to listen to the experts on the subject. And so I'll do a very short introduction of our panelists. And when the panelist concerned speaks, please do give a more detailed introduction because I think you will be the best person to talk about yourself. So to start off, we have Dr. Pervez Amirali Hoodbhoy. He is a nuclear physicist and activist who serves as Zohra and ZZ Ahmed Foundation Distinguished Professor at the Forman Christian College and previously taught physics at the 𝐸𝑑𝑖𝑜𝑠 University. Professor Hoodbhoy is also a prominent activist, in particular concerned with promotion of freedom of speech, secularism, scientific temper, and a subject close to my heart, education in Pakistan. Then we have Dr. Amber Beckley. She's a criminologist whose research focuses on how development factors influence criminal offending and victimization across life forces. Third, we have Dr. Richard Cincotta. He's a Wilson Center Global Fellow and Director of the Global Political Demography Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on the influence of the demographic transition on political, institutional, and environmental conditions. And finally, we have Professor Christian Leuprecht. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. He's a class of 1965 professor in leadership Department of Political Science, Royal Military College, on leave as Matthew Flinders Fellow at Flinders University in South Australia. An expert on security and defense, political demography, and comparative federalism and multi-level governance, he's regularly called as an expert witness to testify before committees of parliament. So as everybody can see, we really have a really distinguished panel here today. And I think the topic that we have picked for this evening is one of great interest, because I think it affects each of our lives in an integral way. And particularly over the last 2 years, I think we've seen how deeply, non-traditional security threats can impact lives, livelihoods across the globe. So typically, the concept, I think, of the traditional security threat emerged post-global, the Cold War, when globalization, international terrorism, and global climate change came to the fore and became issues that created large threats to populations across the world. And I think it was at this time that there was this felt need to define. I mean, everybody is aware of what is a traditional security threat in terms of defense, in terms of military threats, because these are well defined, easy to define because they are quantifiable in a certain way, whereas there is a certain fuzziness in terms of the players, the fact that it crosses geographies and demographies that non-traditional security threats pose. I think I'd like to start off with a definition. I'm sure this must have been defined before, but since this is my first time at the process, I think one widely accepted definition, and everybody is aware of this, is of what a traditional security, non-traditional security threat is: challenges to the survival and well-being of people and states that arise out of non-military sources, such as climate change, cross-border environmental degradation and resource depletion, infectious diseases, natural disasters, irregular migration, food shortages, people trafficking, drug trafficking, and other forms of transnational crime. The underlying factors, I think, to these threats typically emanate from positions of inequity, lack of access, and social, economic, religious, gender, and financial exclusion. Because at the bottom of all of this, the underpinning factors are these. Threats to international national security have shifted from interstate conflict to more complex issues. States perceive new threats to security and try to respond to them either unilaterally or through globally accepted entities such as the UN or any other, the large intergovernmental agencies that define these positions and have the power and the capacity to influence these positions. But having said that, I'm really not sure about the influence part of it any longer, as we've been seeing over the past few years. I think today the most commonly identified issues are poverty, infectious diseases, environmental degradation. According to the World Bank, 700 million people have suffered due to disasters over the last decade. Terrorism, narco-terrorism, climate change, and of course, the largest gorilla in the room today, the global COVID pandemic, as opposed to more localized outbreaks of the past. I think the only comparable pandemic of this sort was in 1918, 1919, when about 30 million people died because of the Spanish flu. Post that, there have been mostly localized outbreaks of various disease, but not to the extent and the severity that we have seen with COVID. The fallout of all of this is, especially with COVID, I think factors such as inequities, lack of access to employment, breakdown in and impact on trade, travel, manufacturing, tourism, construction across the world have all kind of come together to create negative synergies, if one may say so, because the impact, like I said, since it's a non-conventional security threat, is felt across borders. And with the large scale of globalization and the fact of interdependencies across countries over various parameters, I think this has brought these aspects far more starkly to the fore, and we've all felt the impact of this. The pandemic has shown the devastation that so-called non-traditional security threats can cause on a global scale. Preventing and addressing poverty, food insecurity, and displacement caused by such disruption is the only way to sustain peace across the globe. Just to cite an example, in a country like India, for instance, urbanization is a major cause of concern. Today, 377 million people live in urban India. In another 10 years, 600 million people will have moved, and in 2051, 850 million people, which is almost 50% of India's population at that point, will have moved to cities. The kind of impact this will have on infrastructure, civic amenities, jobs, is something that all of us can perceive right now. And one only hopes that the learning that we've had over the years, and especially the fact that the issue of climate being core to all of this, should be driving conversations across the globe. And currently, as we see it, I think the inward-looking policies of most countries don't really encourage such behavior. It's one thing to come onto platforms and say the right things, and quite another to go back and start implementing them. And of course, the inequities in terms of consumption across different countries. So you have countries that have already had their share of having had access to consumption and now want to conserve. And there are others coming up the curve thinking it's really unfair that they should not be allowed to consume when now it's their turn to do so, just because other people think that they shouldn't. So these kind of conversations are very nuanced, and there is no simple single solution to any of this. Having said that, I think I should now leave the floor open to the experts on the subject. To start with, I will start with Dr. Pervez, because your subject is very close to my heart, and that is education. I have recently moved into this area, and I work with government primary schools across India, which are basically low resource schools. So the kind of inequities that have been evident as a part of the closure of schools due to the pandemic have revealed the kind of inequities that exist in terms of how children can approach education. Although there was a lot of talk about, the digital enabling of education, I don't believe in the term EdTech, digital enabling of education. We have seen that this has actually created a far greater divide, especially in countries where education is not equally dispersed. And this kind of fallout has affected various things. Particularly, there has been a massive loss of learning. So although there is a tendency to take children over to the next class saying that, oh, but it was not your fault that you missed the entire academic year. The fact is the loss of learning is something that cannot be taken away. And once you have loss of learning with the first, the foundational part of literacy and numeracy, it is very difficult to catch up later. So Dr. Pervez, I'd like your opinion on or your views on how you think the pandemic has affected learning, particularly in low resource schools and across vulnerable populations of children, and how this will impact going forward the whole aspect of employment, employability, ability to be a part of the workforce.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not sure I'm the right person with whom to begin. First of all, I am not an educationist. I'm a physicist. I am a very concerned Pakistani. And by the way, I'm speaking here from Islamabad. I don't know where people are located. It would be nice if they told us where they are. But since you have asked me to speak on education, and particularly the issue of access to education, well, I'll tell you that there are 30 million Pakistani kids out of school, and there are no plans for getting them in. Instead, since the coming of the Imran Khan government, we've had a movement in a very different direction in education, which is for the insertion of religious and national ideology into the curriculum. And in fact, as soon as we are through with this session over here, there's a TV crew that's going to come and ask me to talk about this. But then I've talked about it 50 times earlier. It doesn't make any difference at all. But let me tell you what has happened since this government has come to power. So there are enormous inequities in education in Pakistan, as you can imagine. There are kids who go to lower-end private educational institutions, and they pay between, let's say, 200 rupees a month and 600 rupees a month. Then there are the middle ones from there onwards, and the high-end ones are like 30, 40, 50,000 rupees a month. So there's an enormous spread over there. These are the schools, the regular schools, the so-called secular schools, but then there are the madrasas. The madrasas account for roughly 10% of the kids in school. I mean, you could call them kinds of schools, but they're actually schools with a very specific purpose. They're there to brainwash, and they're there to induct young minds into very definite ideologies. And so when this government came to power, it came with the promise that it is now delivering upon, which says that we're going to equalize everything. And so this is called the single national curriculum, 𝑉 قومی نصاب in Urdu. Okay, so the content of that single national curriculum is, first of all, a huge insertion of religiosity. And so, whereas kids were asked to, of course, learn the Quran at home earlier, and then in later years of Pakistan, that was introduced to a level somewhat in schools. Now they have to be able to finish the whole Quran by the time they exit school, and that means that within 12 years they have to be able to go through the entire book. Now that is not easy. So look, I went to a school and we never learned the Quran in school, but we learned it at home. Now it's been transferred into the school, and now the kids have to not only read it in Arabic, which is not easy, even if you were if you are an Urdu speaker. So it's like if you know Hindi, it doesn't mean you know Sanskrit. It's different. So they have to now learn parts of the Quran in Arabic, remember that, learn the translations in Urdu. But that's not doesn't end over there. They have to learn parts of the Prophet's life, and that's in Arabic, know it in Urdu as well, and then learn various prayers. So what's the prayer when you're climbing up the stairs? What's the right prayer for when you're climbing down? What's the prayer before you start eating, during eating? If you burp, what happens? So this is something that is bothering people in Pakistan. Is bothering those who have thinking minds. And for the rest, well, they say, well, look, it's equaling up what was a very inequitous system before. The madrasas were totally different from the regular schools. And Imran Khan has come up with this leveling scheme that puts the madrasas on par with the regular schools. And so I've written about it, and I've spoken about it, and I'll keep speaking about it, but it doesn't seem to make a damn difference. What's now alarming is even beyond this is the introduction of a fourth language. And for the time being, it's limited to Islamabad. So the kids in this neighborhood, they're learning Arabic. They have to learn Arabic. Now, they can't express themselves properly in English. If their mother tongue is not Urdu, and the kids around here speak Punjabi or Pashto, that's their mother tongue, they can't express themselves properly in Urdu either. And so a fourth language, an alien language, is now being thrust upon them. And this, it seems to be unstoppable, except in the province of Sindh, because education is a provincial subject. And so the government has not been able to ram it down the throats of the kids of Sindh province. But everywhere else, it seems to be going through. And this, to me, is a major danger. This is a big danger. But then, since you want me to talk about more generally, I'll say that, look, it's basically the kids who don't have access to any kind of education. And why don't they have access to education? Is because, well, there's no money for schools. And why is there no money for schools? Well, it's basically because we spend too much on other things. And what are the other things? Well, you know what they are. We have a lot of nukes between you and us. Yeah, we love making bombs and aircraft and getting ready to go to war with each other. And when we look across the border, we see over there on that side, on your side, somebody ready to pounce on us. And it's not true, I know, but that's what creates the climate for hostility. So as I see it, the most important thing is to get some kind of a working relationship between India and Pakistan. And that is going to then have, as a trickle-down effect, so much else for Pakistan and for India, of course, more for Pakistan than for India. The wastage on defense, the fact that we have common issues like that of scarcity of water. And by the way, even though it's monsoon time over here, yet there's no water or not enough water in the lakes and rivers. And so even in the monsoon, we're drilling into the aquifer below, and sooner or later that aquifer is going to give out. Water scarcity is there on your side, on our side. Something that we have to address together. So I could go on and on, but basically, look.
Hoodbhoy, if I may interrupt you for a moment, you know, you've spoken at length about the whole, the turn that education has taken in the country. And from a perspective of employability, and you know, becoming a part of the workforce, working globally, etc. What do you think the impact is? I mean, I have just 1 minute more because I will have to let the others come in as well, but you have another minute.
It's absolutely essential to give working skills, and the Pakistani educational system is not doing that. It's not doing that at the secondary level, and even more, it's not doing that at the college level. The college level is teaching them stuff that is of absolutely no use, and it's not of any use either intellectually or in terms of vocational skills, and that's another part of the fight that we have to fight.
Thank you so much for those insights. I think they've given us a sense of what future populations are looking at or staring at, and we do hope that there is more equity in terms of access to education. Now I would like to, thank you so much, Dr. Hoodbhoy. Now I would like to come to you, Dr. Amber Beckley. The area that you work on is one of great interest in terms of the fact, one of the things that, especially in a country like ours, that really interests us is the whole aspect of skewed sex ratios. And although we know that on a world scale, the actual difference is not that great, because 101.69 males, I don't know how you account for 0.69 males per 100 females, which actually isn't, a huge difference. But this, I think, is really not a representative figure, because it differs from country to country based on various aspects, including social patriarchy, very different factors that affect sex ratios in different countries across the world. So my question to you is, this is not really, okay, fine. So what are the threats that are posed by a skewed ratio of this manner? And is there a pattern to it? Because there are a whole lot of misconceptions about this. There is an understanding that if there are more males, then there is going to be, they will be the dominant ones and females will get oppressed. But there are patterns here which don't really sometimes work out quite in that direction. So what are the actual patterns that emerge when there is a skewed sex ratio, and how does it impact this whole non-conventional threat scenario?
Yeah, well, thanks for letting me talk about this, and it's really great to be able to present this work and to a non-European audience. I work in Sweden, and so most of my interactions are with people from Sweden and other Nordic countries. So this is really nice. And so let me just back up and sort of talk about like what the skewed sex ratio means, right? You sort of touched on it. And so it means, there's this uneven proportion of men and women in the population. And that's a little odd. That's maybe not a natural thing, because as far as we know, sex at birth is this random process, right? We would naturally expect there to be roughly even proportions of men and women in the population. And this, we also maybe even would expect there might be slightly more women, because women tend to, on average, live longer, again, across the whole world, this is. But in many countries, there are actually more men than women, which, in India is a very common thing. And one reason for that is due to sort of culturally based preferences for sons, combined with people having fewer children. So that really means that if a family decides to only have one child, they would prefer that child to be male. And the way that they do that then is by sex-selected abortions while a woman is pregnant. If the woman is carrying a female fetus, the female fetus can be aborted. And the other way that happens is through what we call excess mortality, or basically a higher likelihood of women dying really before they naturally would. So China and India are probably the two biggest or the most prominent locations where there are imbalanced sex ratios. I think I read recently that there's the missing women phenomenon from India and China is just, there's hundreds of thousands possibly of missing women due to the sex imbalance going on in those two countries alone. But smaller countries like Vietnam, Azerbaijan, Armenia, they also have imbalanced sex ratios, even though their populations are much smaller. So maybe they're not having as big of a global impact. So what the sex ratio looks like, and you kind of touched on it, is that for about every 10 women, there's maybe 11 or 12 men. And that doesn't really seem like a lot. But of course, you get to 1 million women and all of a sudden you have 120,000 more men. And that's a lot. That's quite a lot of extra men, we would say. So why, from my perspective as a criminologist, would I see this as a problem? So I study crime and why people might commit crime. But one thing we know for sure is kind of a criminological fact is that men are known across the world to be more involved in crime. Evidence from places like the United States, from Sweden, they tend to indicate that men are about 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested for violent crime compared to women. So if we have all these, excess men, we're going to be concerned that there's just going to be more crime in general, right? So let's say that this is true, like maybe 1 in 25 men get arrested for a violent crime. So if we have some kind of hypothetical country with, I don't know, 1 million women and a sex ratio imbalance equal to places like India or China, in this hypothetical country, there's going to be about 2,400 extra men arrested for violence versus whether in a country where the sex ratio would have been balanced. But we also then start to think that maybe it's possible that these excess men, their contribution to sort of excess crime isn't just a raw number, right? There's not this kind of linear association when there are excess men. Maybe when we have excess men, the effect of these extra men is actually something more exponential, if you will. And why we think that is that one basic idea is that we think that marriage probably does something to stop people from committing crime and violent crime. That if you have a partner, and provided the partner is not committing violent crime as well, that you will sort of become like your partner. Your partner will keep you sort of away from crime. You don't want to lose your partner, so you try not to do things that would pull you away from them and take you away from them. So, if there are excess men who are likely to be predominantly, heterosexual, that would mean that there's a lower proportion of men in the population are going to be getting married, right? And then maybe because there's a lower proportion of men in the population getting married, that this crime is actually going to be even worse than it was before. So, if we kind of go back to this like previous hypothetical example with these extra 2,400 people that would be arrested for violence, let's say that maybe instead, if we hadn't had that sex imbalance, there might be like 3,000 extra people if we really think that there's this marriage effect. So we kind of get this extra bump because of this synergy between extra men and their behavior. And so, in fact, some of my research that was led by my colleague, Andreas Filser, in that research, we did find evidence to support this idea that these male-skewed sex ratios are associated with a greater proportion of men being arrested. And of course, the implications for this on a societal level are relative to the criminal justice system. It becomes more costly. There's, of course, just the adverse impact of more violent crime in society. And then there's these, ripple effects that we're sort of talking about that Dr. Hoodbhoy sort of touched on, that, when people are arrested, they're going to have a harder time becoming employed, for example. So the effects of this excess crime these skewed sex ratios could really sort of translate to this excess crime, which then just sort of filters through the rest of society. So that's why, that's where my interest in it lies, and that's why we're concerned about this from a crime perspective.
Okay, so just to take that argument a little forward, the fact remains, like you yourself said, birth is something that can't be predetermined. So, but if it is an issue that is a cause for concern, because like you said, a higher proportion of men in the population leads to greater levels of crime. And if we are to view that as a non-conventional threat, because it is a fact across several countries, and, not just the countries that you mentioned, particularly, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. These are facts for various reasons. How does one address it from that perspective? Because birth can't be predetermined.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really complicated question, to be perfectly honest, right? Because if these sex imbalances are coming about due to things like, you know, sex-selected abortion, and because of this value of male children and sons, that these are sort of like deeply, you know, culturally held beliefs and attitudes, and these kind of things are very difficult to change, right? We can't just make a law that says, well, now abortion's illegal, right? I mean, we make laws like that and they don't work. Instead, probably more women will end up dying if we do things like that, right? So, you know, I think the mechanisms of change that have to come about probably have to do more with, you know, educating people, informing them about, you know, maybe why, you know, son preference, you know, maybe you have that, but it may not be good for society, and maybe, you know, trying to change these broader attitudes. And yeah, I mean, again, this just ties back to the educational component. And I think that, you know, without these sort of structures, it would be very hard to change these kind of things.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Beckley. And now I will move on to Dr. Richard Cincotta. Dr. Cincotta, I'd like to ask you a question on the youth bulge. And for me, nothing is more, you know, topical at the moment, except the, you know, the demography in the country I live in. 65% of the population is below 35 years today. And we are, as we've seen, I mean, even pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we are increasingly emerging into a jobless economy due to the fact of, you know, the whole machine learning, AI, digitization of jobs, etc. Increasingly moving into a jobless, job scarce economy, and with the largest part of the population being at a level of 35 years. Now, what kind of impact do you think these sort of circumstances, the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of proper employability while being trained vocationally, etc., would impact any country with a larger part of the demography being a young population?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And you've asked the central question, actually. And in the case of India, it's actually quite promising. I know if you follow the demographic health, the family health surveys that have been carried on through IPS in Mumbai, the latest ones suggest that most Indian states, almost all Indian states, are at or below the replacement level, around 2 children per woman. The exceptions have been exceptions for a long time, and their populations have behaved more like Pakistan than the other states of India. Their fertility rates are elevated, but in fact, and what I'm talking about is the sort of the central north states, UP and Bihar in particular. In those states, fertility has moved down to 3 children per woman. That's promising. There's an enormous amount of momentum. Momentum is created by having a youthful age structure, a sustained high fertility over a long period of time. And so those populations will continue to grow for quite some time, even when they come down to about 2 children per woman, which is probably going to happen and happen slowly. It's not guaranteed, of course. It takes effort. It doesn't happen naturally. That seems to be a myth that circulates. But it happens because women get educated and women participate in the workforce. And over time, they get a smaller desired family size, and they realize that typically through modern contraception. Not only, but typically through modern contraception. And that has become more and more available in India in particular, which has had for quite a long time competent family planning programs, well-staffed, but not in all states. And so it's a state issue. Of course, in the South, it happened first, and in the West and East, it happened a little bit later. And now you're looking at the challenge of UP and 𝐵𝑢𝑙𝑔𝑒, which has been a long-term challenge, as we know. So I rather than show, I have a few slides, but I think I'll talk, and we can refer to the slides in case you're interested. If the central problem, as you noted, is rapid growth in particular parts of the age structure. Rapid growth is always kind of the sort of the Malthusian threat everyone's concerned, but most of the most regions of the world have been able to meet this sort of threat of food insecurity through agricultural production and through trade, essentially trade. So that's not every region. We're looking forward to more challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. That is if I had a little map, I have a little map on the slides, but we can refer to them if you're interested.
Would you like me to share the screen?
Yeah, could you share the slides? I think I won't, since I've taken up some time already, I won't look through all of them. What I'll do is I'll basically, can you advance to the map? There's a first map.
Yep.
Let's see. Okay. So if we were looking at the world today, well, this is actually going back to 1995. If you look at that map, you can see the red is the most youthful countries in the world. And that's what people call, that's what demographers call them. The youth bulge is a somewhat difficult phrase that means different things to different people, but the most youthful countries of the world have, as you can see on the left, have very pyramidal age structures where there's rapid growth in the workforce and the school-age children, where there's a lack of taxable people. Even if they have jobs, it's very difficult to support the number of number of children that are stocked up in that age structure, and because they're already born, it's very difficult to get rid of that of growth until you get to, say, the second category, which is called the intermediate category. So there's also beyond that the mature category, and then now a new category, which we look at populations where median age is over 45. So that post-mature age structures are starting to emerge in different parts of the world. And as I show you these maps, you'll see some of them. Anyway, if we look at 1995, we can see that kind of dichotomy that we've all grown up with, which was the developed and underdeveloped nations. And that was largely mirrored through age structure. And most demographers think it is an essential part of being underdeveloped is having a youthful age structure. But by 2010, you can see that dichotomy breaking up. In East Asia, progress and that's fertility has declined and age structures have become more mature. And but there still is this, what people call the arc of instability, which went through the Andes and Central America through sub-Saharan Africa into the Middle East and ultimately to South Asia and parts of Central Asia. If we move to the next one, you can see the next slide, please. Well, let's see. Oh, blip, blip. Okay, next, there you go. Oh, we missed it.
At my end, sorry, it's just usually.
Okay, I can't. Well, okay, well, there you go. Okay, right there. No, okay, I'll try to do work with that one. There you go. You got it. Thank you, Pallavi. If you move to 2015, you can see just in 5 years, you can see what's happening is that northern and southern Africa have become more mature in some, and which very often heralds the establishment of high levels of democracy and stable levels, that is. And if you look over to southern and South Asia and Central Asia, you can see changes going on there, India in particular. But of course, as we said, India is many countries, maybe that have varied age structures. And if you look into the future using the UN Population Division's median projection, you can see that we're sort of saddled with several countries that are that are youthful and have security issues: Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and then much of sub-Saharan or central sub-Saharan Africa, that is the Sahel, West Africa and Central Africa and East Africa, but changes occurring there as well. But I will note that even though the projections for Pakistan are positive, Egypt and Pakistan have never really made that median projection. They've always fallen short, but we can be hopeful, and we can be hopeful about the central northern states of India as well. There are changes going on, but it's going on a bit late, as we saw in Afghanistan. Too little, too late to change the age structure to make it a place where people can get employment and where children can get schooling. So if you can move it on for one more slide. Forward. Yeah, that's hard. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, I wonder why it's acting up. I can't move this, can I? Okay. Well, yeah. Let's forget. Okay, we must be out of time anyway. So you're muted, Pallavi. Did you have a?
Sometimes it has that issue with me. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Here, let's just stop with this one, because this shows the issue quite readily. Is that people have ignored how age structure influences development, but here are the 4 World Bank income categories in 2018. And if you look at the low category, you can see it is almost completely made up of youthful countries. That one country that's up there at the top, that is an intermediate category country, is North Korea, which tries very hard to keep its people poor and underdeveloped. So as you move into the categories, you can see that age structure, statistically at least, seems to be associated with income class. And this goes on to conflict. Most conflicts begin in the youthful. I have another slide on that, but we'll just stop here. Is most countries, the revolution is sort of the property of youthful countries. Separatist conflict, not so much. It typically starts when countries are youthful, but persists through other ones, but through other stages of maturity. Youthful conflict, they're almost synonymous. And at any one point in time, there's probably from 25 to 35% of youthful countries have been engaged in conflict for over the last 5 years. And it's most persistent in youthful countries as well. So I return on the last point is our way out of this is actually through girls' education, women, I would say women's rights, but other people would just say more women's participation, and ultimately a means by which couples can regulate their fertility, can have the number of children they want, when they're healthy, and that they can take them, they can support them through school, and that governments can support the number of children that are entering school and employ the number of children that adolescents and young adults that are leaving school. And with that point, I'll end it. It's a very simple message, and one that is easy to see if you take a look at how development lines up with population age structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cincotta. That was very insightful, and it I think explained a lot of issues, especially about unrest and displacement and the kind of fallout that happen when there is a younger population and not the economic resources and the growth to commensurate to that population. I will now move on to Professor Kristin Leuprecht. And my question to you would be that the main challenges posed by the end of demographic transition include a lack of resources to provide for the entire global population. And we've seen that increasingly across the years. Each region faces a distinct future based on levels of economic development, demographics, and geography. How do these factors play out, particularly in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, so first a good evening to our friends, partners, and allies in India. I've been to your absolutely fantastic country twice, and it was an absolutely delight both times. It is a country that I think defies my understanding and imagination, how you make it work, and especially how you make it work as the world's most populous democracy. And so it's a real pleasure, because I realize that things aren't always easy in India and in Indian democracy, but I think it is also a model to the world that countries that face many challenges, whether they're demographic, climate, or economic, can still make genuine endeavors to try to govern themselves democratically. And I realize Indian democracy has its challenges, but I think there's so much to be learned from India, and so little that I understand about your country. So it's a real pleasure to be able to be with you. And some of the colleagues here with us today, thanks to the people who preceded me, in particular Richard, who I've known for over 2 decades, and whose work I think has been groundbreaking and path-breaking in some of these conversations. Can you see the slides that I put up here?
Yes, we can see them.
All right, so then let's see if I can get the
Okay.
I'll just, I don't know what stopped at the end there. So I'll just take 5 minutes and just, I think, on the premise that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I did have the privilege of living in Australia for over a year. Not that in any way means I actually understand the Indo-Pacific region, but it does give you a different perspective, I think, on the world. And I think it's clearly the part of the world that is going to, in many ways, determine the 21st century in terms of its outcomes, in terms of norms, values, the international system, the rules-based system that we're going to have. So I think it's a highly poignant conversation. If you understand some of the changes that I'm going to talk about, this is a nice little book to look at: Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum. And of course, plagues, well, we're in the middle of one, so we can actually test some of these hypotheses. So just so to understand what's driving some of the demographic change, and I always think demography and climate change are two of these structural determinants that can actually give us real traction on the future. So much of what we study in the social sciences tends to be the past. And so we collect a bunch of data and then we analyze those data. But really, in many cases, I think the past is not a particularly good predictor of the future anymore. I mean, we've seen this, for instance, with regards to economic developments, where past market developments are simply not a good trajectory for how the world is likely going to, the economic underpinnings of the future, for instance. And so I think the reason why I like demography is precisely because, as Richard and Amber already hinted at, they give us some traction on the future, and they give us currency on the future, and they give us a remarkably reliable currency on the future. So we can tell you with considerable accuracy what not just India or the region will look like demographically, but what different states in India, different cities in India, different local regions in India will look like. So it is really a fantastic tool in terms of understanding and forecasting, in part because, as Richard pointed out, so much of the population is already born, and with people sort of living longer, we actually get reasonably accurate traction on the future. The other is climate change. I would say I'm a bit less confident about climate change giving us good traction on the future, in part because some of the data is simply doesn't give us the sort of reliability that we can get from demographics. But it's clear that the world is undergoing significant change on both counts. And what's significant about that change is that it's historically unprecedented change. We've never had a world where the average population is as old as it is now, or aging as quickly. We've never had a world where over 50% of the population lives in cities. We haven't had a world that has this extent of population, both in absolute numbers and in relative density, relative to the sort of climate change that the world is undergoing. So I think we're undergoing an unprecedented extent of competition, of transformation as a result. And the next 30 years will be, if we think the last 30 years were interesting, I think the next 30 years will be particularly interesting. So here's just a little bit of sort of what gives you sort of some of the sense of how the world is changing. So the two big revolutions have been public health and food security. And so you can see in a pandemic, when you don't have robust public health, you tend to get worse outcomes than countries that with robust public health. And you can see in places such as Ethiopia, for instance, the difference that food security has made. I mean, Ethiopia is always a critical case study when it comes to food security. And you can see what happened after the 1980s and the famine, when we actually established systems for food security, and the consequences of those systems now being undermined as a result of conflict. You can also see the nature of the diseases from which people die changing pretty rapidly, in particular heart disease and cancer, sort of the two main sources of disease causing death. Here's sort of just another sort of way to put this together. The way sort of now disease, preventable and treatable diseases and injuries sort of compound to give you a sense of how the world is changing, and that in many cases there's still considerable inroads that we can make, because if you think about all these preventable diseases and you think about injuries, which in many cases are also preventable, the more inroads we make, the more the population will continue to grow and expand. And perhaps, as you know, we're looking at perhaps another 3 billion people or so in the next 30 to 40 years on the planet, most of them being born in countries that are already among the least sustainable politically, economically, and socially. So considerable challenges here. You can see the impact of what I just said sort of has on life expectancy. We won't go sort of the demographic transition, but sort of the delta between fertility and mortality explains why you end up getting population growth. And Richard already explained sort of the lag effect of young populations. So it takes you get significant population growth, and it takes a long time for that curve to come down. But the real sort of other element here is, if you think about population growth, you can do this, and this is why I pointed out the book at the beginning, is all these other trends where we're having upward trends. So the socioeconomic trends sort of over the last 250 or so years, and then the Earth system trends. And so it reinforces, I'm trying to reinforce the point that we live in times that are simply historically, structurally unprecedented in terms of what we're facing. Look at water use, look at telecommunications, look at the loss of tropical land, and so forth. And so you get a sense of here where populations are growing and where populations are shrinking. But I think the real sort of point to push to that hits home here is that if you look at that little circle there, and Richard will have seen this picture before, that there's more people living inside this circle than outside of it. And so you can see where the demographic action is happening. And so all these changes that Amber and Richard already alluded to, they are really hitting home in that particular part in your particular neighborhood. You can also see that some of the youngest countries, as Richard, for instance, pointed out, are also some of the most ethnically diverse countries, and different ethnic groups have different demographic trends. And so that then also drives some of the internal conflicts. I'll just kind of skip some of the slides here, but you can see some of the relationships between demographic developments and economic developments. But the real, I think, broader story here is one of the decline. So the portion of what we've traditionally called developed countries relative to the rest of the world. And so the considerable expansion strength of the proportion that what we traditionally refer to as developing countries or undeveloped countries or underdeveloped countries, low income countries, that are making up a growing proportion of the globe in terms of their proportion of the population. And that has significant implications for the order of the most populous countries in the world. You can see there's not much change between 1950 and 2005, but you can see that once we get to 2050, the first three countries don't really change. So you can see that India and China continue to contest for the top spot. But if you look at spot 4 onwards, you see a significant change in the number of countries that are up and coming here. And so this is going to drive a lot of sort of the political implications from demography. I should have said, by the way, I should have just started with, so what's demography? It's basically fertility, mortality, and migration. And then what interests me in particular is political demography, so the political implications of those demographic changes. And so you can see here many of sort of our traditional, what we refer to as the developed countries, the West, NATO countries, allied countries, so forth, but also the entire post-Soviet space is undergoing significant population decline. And so you can see this by, Richard already talked about this, the rapid increase in median age that different countries are experiencing. If you look at countries such as Japan, I mean, this is sort of a loose projection, but Japan is projected to have a median age of perhaps 71 years by 2100. What does a democracy look like when you have the majority of the population being of retirement age? We can talk about this another time, but it has significant policy implications. And so you can see here countries, even in your own neighborhoods, such as Taiwan, that are projected to be over 50. But this also has significant, I didn't put this slide in, sorry, I forgot, but it has significant implications for China, because China is, of course, hitting its peak labor force currently. So about 2025, and then we'll see decline in its peak labor force. And so one of the hypotheses as to why China is doubling down on sort of its bid for global dominance and essentially overturning the global political order and global economic order, the post-Cold War order, is precisely because China has a very small window where it has the economic and population advantage that it can ultimately harness. And so if it doesn't double down now, that in terms of those structural constraints, this opportunity will never come again. And so this is one of the explanations for why the Chinese are going as hard as they are. But I'll just close on sort of a couple of slides here that I think reinforce some of the stressors here. That those same countries where you have disproportionately young populations that are ethnically diverse, that already have significant challenges in terms of their political infrastructure, their economic infrastructure, and social relations, are also the countries that are the hardest hit by climate change. So you can see here the impact of climate change overall and their vulnerability to climate change. And you can see, of course, India figures here prominently. And you can see so the impact of climate change on agricultural yields. We talked about food security before. And so you can see here that a significant portion of those countries with the youngest populations are also going to continue to be or become unable to feed their populations. So this, of course, has significant consequences for conflict, for instability, for migratory flows, and so forth. And I always tell my friends in Europe that if you think that 2015 was a bit of a challenge with 1 million people showing up on your borders, just wait, there's a sequence to that. There's a sequel to that movie. And so I'll just finish on sort of the global distribution of vulnerability. And so this takes into account the ability of countries to compensate for the impact of, for instance, climate change and for food security, for instance, through technology, through prosperity, through research and development, and so forth. And you can see that that gives you a very different map. And part of the reason why I put that up is because you live in a challenging neighborhood. And India is actually one of the countries that is better positioned than most of the countries in your neighborhood to mitigate some of the consequences of demographic change and climate change that you're facing. So I think this is good news for India, but it is also raises interesting questions about that. I think there'll be continued challenges in the neighborhood. You can see that China is much not as well positioned as India, based on sort of some of the data that we have. And so I think India, with this experience, will be able to also play a significant role in the world of how do we stabilize countries that face significant demographic change, significant impacts by climate change, because its conditions are going to be so much closer, and its experience is so much closer to many of those countries that that face these types of challenges. So I'll leave it at that, but I hope this gives you something to think about, and why demographics, climate change, their combined effects are so interesting to study and give us significant traction on the challenges that we want to prepare for, and why I started with a shout out to India, not just as our friends, but as our partners and allies.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Leuprecht. And I think that was really interesting, because the whole idea of demography being a really large player in the whole conversation around non-conventional threats. And we see it happening increasingly because of various reasons. And so for us, I think your presentation has really given us a great deal of insight into, how the demography can affect the way the economy and other aspects of a country moves forward. I think now what we will do is, Pallavi, how are we for time? We have another half an hour?
Yeah, about 25 minutes, yes. Yeah, so it's good.
All right, so there have been a lot of questions that have come in from the audience to our various speakers. So I think what I will do now is pose these questions to the concerned speakers. And I'm sure people will really look forward to hearing the responses to that. So I think the first question is for Dr. Hoodbhoy. How does the state's insistence on religious education in school reshape the future threat environment? Complex question. You're on mute, Dr. Hoodbhoy. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Just, can I take this, the question just a little bit later? My cat is at the door.
Definitely, definitely. All right. So then I will move on to you, Dr. Beckley. So the question posed for you is, does research reveal that balanced sex ratios correlate to diminishing security threats?
Yeah, I mean, at least the research I've done has shown that there are some particulars by, maybe who is committing crimes against whom, if that's the kind of security threats we're talking about. Of course, my research was done in Sweden, so it's a very different place demographically and, structurally, but this is always the thing when people do research in Sweden. We seem to find that it's not that unique in terms of the way people behave. So I think it's applicable to other places. So.
Thank you, and I'll come back to you now, Dr. Hoodbhoy.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
How does the state's insistence on religious education in schools reshape the future threat environment?
Well, it reduces the the ability of students to see beyond their own very narrow religious or national perspectives. And so it makes it easier to demonize those that you don't like. I'm afraid I see this on the Indian side as well, but I can see it much more clearly on my side, on the Pakistani side. And I must contrast this with how things used to be when I was in school, where we used to learn the history of India. So we learned about Chandragupta Maurya, we learned about the Indian empires, we learned about Harappa. But now kids, and we even knew what Nalanda was at that time. But now kids are not being taught that. So it's very focused on Islam on the subcontinent, and then in books, sometimes it's explicit that there's the enemy across the border. So I think this is absolutely reprehensible. This is something that we have to fight in Pakistan, and to the extent that this exists in India, you've got to fight your battles over there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Cincotta, we have a question for you now. So the question is, how does youth bulge of minority groups in any country, especially with tensions between various ethnic groups, impact the security situation? You're on mute, Dr. Richard. You need to unmute yourself.
And it again. I'm sorry. Thank you. It's a great question, and it's one that Christian Leuprecht has done a great job with. But I'll try to capture some of the research that he's done, and some of it that I've done. And if as Christian said, most countries, particularly in Asia and on the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa, were the borders are quite artificial, and sometimes the result of colonialism or empire building in some way. And what they've done is left minorities inside countries that are dominated politically and economically by majorities whose fertility rate has declined at a rate that's faster than the minorities. Sometimes it's the opposite way, but very often in Asia it's been the opposite way, and that sometimes Chinese and South Asian minorities have declined faster than, say, the Indonesians and Malays, with consequences in the Filipinos. But typically it's been a stranding of certain minorities who have retained very high fertility rates. And that has a good example is the Kurds in Turkey, the minorities in Israel is a big issue, both the Palestinian minority and also the Haredim of the Jewish minority, who has a very high fertility rate, and it's come to be so important in elections that it's been very difficult to form governments, as you know. Lebanon, but in other countries in Asia in particular. And so what you see is that when the population at the country level looks like it's progressing, and that you should expect perhaps the slow cessation of conflict, the slow increases in development, you have something else happening. You have separatist conflict, and you have sometimes a disenfranchisement of that minority and political difficulties. So that is a kind of a constant theme, but it's part of progress, and it's sort of a leftover of how nation-state borders were created. Don't forget that Europe had a period of about 200 years where it kind of straightened out its minority situation, sometimes ruthlessly. And the rest of the world has had to try to cope. And the best way of coping is not to disenfranchise or to segregate those minorities or to strike them down, but actually to give them more than you gave them before, which is in terms of healthcare, education, and to work with women, which sometimes those minorities, particularly Muslim minorities in some countries, have resisted, or at least been more slow to adapt, I would say. And I think that perhaps Christian has something else to say about that.
Well, I have a very specific question for Dr. Leuprecht. So the question for you is, how does China's rush to assert global dominance, to take opportunity of the small window of demographic advantage, impact the security in the Indo-Pacific region? And as we all know, this is something that is on everybody's mind. The creating of islands in the Indo-Pacific region, not responding to the UN in terms of not dominating the sea and building islands in the South China Sea, etc. So this is something that China has been consistently doing, and you say that there is a small opportunity, a window of opportunity for demographic advantage. How does that impact the security in the Indo-Pacific region?
So it's a great question. Maybe if I can just dovetail on what Richard said. So the microdynamic, we always talk about this as sort of a state level, but I think the microdynamics are just as important, I think, as Richard here pointed out. So if you have, as for instance in Israel, so you tend to get higher fertility and sort of population growth among populations that are either poor or that are religious or highly religious. And so in Israel, of course, you get both. You get some of the highest fertility rates in the world among certain Palestinians, subgroups of certain Palestinian populations, and you also get disproportionately high fertility rates among certain subgroups of the Jewish population. And you can see the results both in terms of the peace process and in terms of the democratic process within Israel. So it's no surprise that we're seeing these stalemates. At the same time, in other parts of the world, if you see population aging among even ethnic or religious groups that have sectarian groups that have been in conflict, you tend to get a stabilization of the conflict, and in particular sort of less violence within that conflict. So I think one of the elements you can use the demographic change in the region for, not just at the state level, but at the sub-state level, is the extent of the prospects for interstate war of violence and the prospects for internal violence. And so one of the more interesting observations is that states with older populations tend to be less likely, it appears, now we don't know whether that's just a spurious sort of accidental correlation or whether it's incidental or deterministic, but appear to be less likely to engage in external conflict. And so to some extent, I mean, the reason I point this out is because if you read people like Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap, there's sort of the hypothesis that China and the US have sort of this 75% of, because of power transitions, have a 75% chance of, historically, if you look at case studies, of going to war. But of course, what's the interest in the US of picking a war with China? And demographically, it would suggest that these are not countries that are particularly prone to be starting a conflict with one another. But what I think we do see in China is that the internal dynamics are very much driving domestic politics. I mean, if you think about the regions that people talk about in the news, you think about the Uyghurs, for instance, you also think about Tibet. Those are some of the regions with the highest demographic growth in China. And so the Chinese regime looked at this and the prospective demographic imbalances that was going to create in those regions, and that was not just driving, but going to continue to drive prospects for separatism. And Tibet is particularly interesting to look at because Tibet has since sort of aged pretty substantially. And so you don't see major violence, for instance, in Tibet, whereas, of course, the Chinese regime did clamp down on some of the activity that, some of the genuine terrorist activity and some of the activity that it perceived as terrorist activity in Xinjiang. And this was very much driven by demographic change. And so one of the ways that the Chinese regime is trying to adapt the local population is essentially trying to socialize them as a way of trying to adapt including adapting their demographic patterns. Now, I think we all have great trouble with this particular social engineering experiment, both in substance and in process. And I think many of us also have doubts about its efficacy. But it's certainly, from a social scientific perspective, it's lots of challenges that we can observe here. But yeah, I mean, it is very much driving, I think, China's approach, in particular to the region, and in particular its bid for regional dominance. Because it knows that there are other countries, such as Indonesia, for instance, that will continue to experience demographic growth, and ostensibly India as well, that will continue to experience demographic growth long beyond when demographic decline, and in particular peak labor force decline, starts to set in China. And so I think there's the sense that the window of opportunity for China in terms of structural conditions, optimal structural conditions, is closing quickly. And so it's not an accident that the timelines that President Xi has picked, for instance, in terms of the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party, in terms of achieving some of those key political and economic goals that China has set for itself in the region and the world, because it knows that it has to double down on those goals now, or there's very little prospect that it will be able to achieve those goals, simply because other countries in the region will have structural conditions that may end up being more favorable to them. Now, that's of course pretty crude. There's a crude measure, sort of demographics. Demographics are never deterministic. They're an intervening variable, but I think it does give us sort of some traction on what the strategy, what some of the dynamics might be that might be driving geopolitical strategy in China.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Leuprecht. Though one wonders, with the kind of military dominance that they are engaging in currently, especially post the pandemic, with the kind of resources that are being driven into military dominance and acquisition, whereas there is a real economic problem, particularly in the hinterland, how this is going to really pan out with that very small window of opportunity. My final question, which is a very interesting question, is to you, Dr. Amber Beckley. And somebody has asked, do you think the recent trend of designer babies impact the sex ratio?
I mean, well, these designer babies, I guess, the initiative behind this genetic engineering of children was to sort of be medically, sort of serve as like a medical donor for maybe like a sick sibling, right? That's where this started, with this this genetic engineering of children. And when it first started, we didn't kind of have the genetic engineering technology we do today. So, nowadays we can actually edit we can edit genes that are in people at this point. We can't edit complex, polygenic things that are controlled by multiple genes. We can't go and edit that. But this idea that we just sort of, fix a little chromosome here or there. I mean, I think that sure, that has the possibility of affecting sex ratios. Of course it does. And I mean, I don't even know if you need to gene edit. You can also just do in vitro fertilization, where you can see ahead of time if the soon-to-be fetus is going to be a boy or a girl. So I think these different ways we can sort of determine what sex a child will be are, you know, they can be very low-tech ways, such as, you know, taking, you know, a camera and looking and seeing and then aborting the baby if that's not the sex you want, or these very complicated things. And I mean, as we saw, as we know, abortion does affect that. So I think maybe as technology advances and as these other technological advances become more accessible, sure, why wouldn't that make a difference? So,
Sure. So I think we have another 4 minutes, so 30 seconds to all speakers. Last thoughts for the day. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Hoodbhoy. You're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, yes. Well, look, I think it's really good that we've had this conversation today. We've seen that the problems are so diverse and they're so localized as well. Of course, the broader ones, climate change, they're there for everybody. But we have our own specific battles to fight. Each one fights it in his or her own way. I wish we had more conversations in which we could in which we would be more specific as to the nature of challenges. But I think you did a great job in bringing so many people together today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Amber Beckley, your last thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for this interesting discussion. I guess I was struck by how often we kept returning to this sort of the way we started this talk, was that, you know, this component of education and how important it is. And yeah, I find it striking that you know, that really seems to be a crux on which a lot of things are based. And so, yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Cincotta, your last thoughts on the subject.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. I think perhaps I learned more than I contributed, but it was an excellent meeting. Thank you so much. My parting thoughts are that it's never too late for countries to make progress on women's rights, and there's more that can be done in South Asia in particular, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, to bring girls into school and women into the workforce. When I think of both Pakistan and India, I think of a very diverse population, multiple languages, places that still lack in some areas, still are far behind, where other places in each of these countries are quite progressive. And it's sad to hear about Imran Khan's idea of a religious injection into education. It's truly a setback. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And the final words, Dr. Leuprecht.
Oh, I've talked plenty. I don't have much to say. I just hope that, you know, demography always tends to be treated as sort of somehow this marginal element in the social sciences in general, and in my discipline, political science in particular. And so hopefully, if I can make a pitch for demography as a more central discipline and factor in the discussions about our societies, then I think we've already made considerable inroads here this morning, and I thank my terrific colleagues and the opportunity to contribute to what is always, in my experience, a lively discussion in India on a challenging topic.
Thank you so much. And so I think we come to the end of today's discussion. I'd like to thank all the eminent panelists who have taken time and have been very frank and candid, which is what probably made this a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Asian Pathfinders, Pallavi, Shreyas, and the team for putting this together. And I wish everybody a really good evening, afternoon, rest of the day. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And
Bye-bye.
thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day, is all I'll say. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.